James here from Sweet Pea Machine Embroidery. We have an exciting new sew-along for any intermediate sewers out there who would like to challenge their skills and make a beautiful tote bag while they do it. There will be a Facebook group where you can find all the details on the sew-along and where you can post photos of your completed bags. The link will be in the video description below. We are super happy to announce the scrappy duffel tote bag will be the design you are making for this sew-along. This clever duffel tote would make a great overnight bag when traveling or a very handy sports bag to hold your gear. It is a perfect design to use up all those fabric scraps you have lying around. The design comes in the 5x7 and the 7x7 hoops. You can use your choice of file and make roughly the same size bag. This allows people with the smaller hoop the ability to create the same size project. This bag is ideal for an intermediate level of sewing experience. In this video, the very talented Martin Smith will be guiding you through the construction of this duffel tote. We provide instructions on how to add piping to the bag, which is optional. We recommend you follow our written, photographed instructions in conjunction with this video tutorial. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please like and subscribe.
When making a block for the scrappy duffel tote, we have some cutaway stabilizer in the hoop, and we place a piece of batting on top of the stabilizer, create our outline, trim back to our stitching, then start applying our fabric to our block using the flip and fold method. We're stitching out a placement line for our first piece of fabric. Ensure we have enough fabric in the seams and on the outside perimeter of the block. Trim back to the stitching, leaving fabric within the seams of the exterior of the block. Put our second piece of fabric by overlapping about 1/4 of an inch past our cut line and stitch into position. Flip the fabric forward, make it flat at the seam, hold in position while it stitches around the perimeter of the next section of fabric. There is no placement line to follow for this. Remove the hoop and trim the final side of this particular piece of fabric. Lay your last piece of fabric 1/4 of an inch past the cut line. Flip the fabric towards the left as we are doing on this particular occasion and stitch the perimeter stitching line. Now we will complete each section by adding the stippling quilting. When the block is complete, remove from the machine and take to our board. We're going to trim our seam allowances back to 1/2 an inch past the stitching line. If you find that you don't have fabric within the seam allowance all the way out to the 1/2 inch edge, it doesn't matter as long as there is enough fabric to hold at the stitching line. There is our block completed. Let's look at making up the end pieces for our duffel tote. So we have 2 sections which we want to join together by doing a flat sashing. So we grab our piece of fabric and we stitch just inside the 1/2 inch stitching line with the block on top so as we can use the stitching line as a guide. Stitch one side. Then put the other block onto the remaining side, again stitching with just a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is just to the left hand side needle position of that final perimeter stitching on our block. There we have our 2 blocks joined. Those seams stay in that position, they don't have to be opened up or turned. You can give that a light press if you wish. Now, let's put our piece of mesh onto this pocket, or onto the side of this end panel. We're going to be binding the top edge of our mesh before placing it onto the joined panels. So mesh doesn't generally have a right and wrong side, but if it does, please have your right side of the mesh up with the wrong side of your binding down. Now I suggest that you have the mesh against the feed dog because it makes it easier to sew, but the mesh does get caught on the teeth of the feed dog, so positioning it to start sewing is a little bit difficult sometimes. Just sew with a 1/2 inch seam. So basically the raw edge is going to be folded to the middle, then we're folding this over one more time, and then we're stitching it down flat. Okay, so we're going to just with our, I'm just using a 1/4 inch foot that has a wide gap in the middle of the foot. And we're just turning that edge over once it's been pressed and stitching it so it covers the existing row of stitching. This is just a quick binding. There we are, our bound edge for our side pocket. Using some quilt clips, just clip the edges together so as that they stay in position while we're going to stitch around the outside edge. Haven't got the curves on this piece of mesh, they're still square. Make sure those are even at the top. And just using the seam, the stitching which you can see through the mesh, just base this with a longer stitch into position. If you want to work from the underside to follow that row of stitching, then please do. There we have it. Just a mesh pocket, which will be at the end panel of our tote. Let's just trim those corners back. So now we're going to put some piping around the outside edge of this end panel. The notes show you actually how to make your piping up just by enveloping a piece of piping cord. Just trim off 1 to 1.5 inches of cord out there so there's nothing at the end of it. Okay, so that's flat, and we're going to start stitching with a zip foot and your needle across as far as possible to actually reach the piping stitching. We're going to start where we have trimmed to. Now we're leaving that piece of piping free at the end so as that doesn't create bulk when we finish and do our overlap. Now I've clipped not into the stitching, halfway through the piping. So this is a 1/2 inch piping cord seam. And we've cut this piping so it's selvage to selvage, so it's not true, it's not on the bias, so therefore it hasn't got the flexibility as normal store-bought piping has got. But with a bag like this, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't need to have that flexibility. We want the piping to be a little bit rigid to give a skeleton to hold the ends of the bags up to keep their shape. So clipping every centimetre or so, or every 3/8 of an inch, just around the curved areas. Keeping those raw edges together on the outside. By all means, pin or use quilt clips, whatever you wish to do. You know, I do not sew like that, so I find it easier not to do that, especially around curves and especially with piping. But if you need to do this, then pin it by all means. Final corner. Right, so we need to have an overlap. So where that starts and stops, we need to chop off another about 1.5 inches. And again, we want to pull our cord out of the piping. And so we want to feel on the underside where we stop that piping so as that your cord just meets inside the tubes, of course, but doesn't create any bulk. Overlap them. And then when we get to our stitching where they cross over, we're going to swing that top layer out to the right hand side and stitch over it. So what that will do, well, it should give you a piping join that's sort of almost invisible. Those two little pieces of piping tubing just gets trimmed off evenly with the edge. So the piping is not as stretchy as being cut on the bias, but we don't really need that. So that will sit inside and be attached to the body of the duffel tote. Let's make our pocket, which will be between the two handle straps. That will go through the body of the tote. So what we're doing is we're just going to get a zip and place it on our piece of lining with the zip facing up and the lining section facing up. So with the needle on the right hand side of the zip foot, just stitch up to the teeth along the edge to attach the zip to the top of this piece of lining. So this is the pocket lining for the side pockets. Okay. Then we want to turn over the edge of the pocket and top stitch it down. So the top edge of the pocket of the panel which we have selected to be the outside of our pocket, we're just going to butt up to those teeth and top stitch it into position. So therefore that seam has got lining one side and the block on the other. Now we've turned that seam allowance over so as it's probably turned over almost 5/8, so as we don't see any of that edge stitching of that block. Fold it over, or fold the lining up and attach it against the top edge of the zip. We're going to stitch across there and around so as all those layers are stitched together. And then we're just going to trim up, so just make sure we haven't got any lining hanging past our perimeter of our block, because this is going to sit on top of the existing block which is already on the side of the duffel tote. And then we're just going to bind that top edge. Because this is a double pocket, so you've got a zip pocket in the front and then a patch pocket at the back. So we're going to do very similar to what we did with the side mesh pockets, but we're going to be stitching so as that we've got the binding on the back, and then we're going to fold it again and then stitch down with a zip foot so as it actually stitches against the teeth and just covers those stitching so the zip is in between the binding and the block. Okay, so we can put our hand inside there and it's all nicely finished and it's lined, and then when we put it onto the side of our duffel tote, you'll see that it's in position and how that works as a patch pocket. Let's make our straps. So we're going to lay our strap fabric out. We're going to spray baste our batting and lay it onto our fabric that we're going to use for our straps. Leave the batting free for about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters at each end. So we're just adhering it with some spray baste. You can just stitch it on with the edges with a long stitch along the sides. You can stitch it on by machine if you don't want to use spray baste. Spray basting is just easier, or you could use an iron-on pellon. It's not matter. We just want to have the batting attached to the fabric. So then we're going to draw a line in the middle of this width. So it's 4 inches wide, so we're going to draw a line 2 inches up into the center, so we can find our center line. Give it a quick spray again. I've just got paper down on my work surface. And then we're just going to fold our raw edges to the center of the line that we've drawn. One thing about spray basting is it's slightly temporary, so if you don't get it quite looking even, you can just unfold it and it will come away quite easily. There we go. So we have our strip made, and then we want to put some, I've put some webbing. So my webbing was around about, it was 1.25 inches. It was it was a little bit wider than normal. But I quite like the look of this. Not all webbing is pressable though. Some of it's nylon and it melts on the iron, so you need to do a little bit of a test. So we've attached our webbing to our bands and just stitch on the edge of the webbing. Let's lay out our blocks. See, there's our center block, which is our pocket. Let's lay out our blocks. Let's join our rows. Okay, so let's join our rows. Press our seams open, join our next row. And join our top row. So we're going to do our top row and our middle row first. So let's sew the seam and then press that seam open. We do our top row and our middle row first, so as that when it is pressed open, we can then lay our pocket block on top. There we go. Match our seams with the perimeter stitching, so it's central. Just pin into position, and we're going to stitch around on those seam or the stitching lines from the edge of the block, down one side, across the bottom, up the other side, so it's attached. And that will give you a patch pocket and a zip pocket. In the same position, of course, but it just doubles the utility of it. Okay, there's our patch pocket, and then we see we've got our second pocket there too. Stitch around the outside edge, just flat, and when that's stitched on, we can add our bottom block so as that the bottom of that pocket is sandwiched in the seam. Okay, so it's sandwiched, but those two side pieces of that pocket block are still raw, but they are going to be covered up by our handles or our straps. Pin. So what we're going to do is the middle of the strap will go over that seam line. So the seam that's running up through which got the blocks on them. So that's going to be the middle of where we're putting the straps on. And we want to mark a 1/2 inch above the top of that pocket binding, because that's where we're going to actually turn across and do some back stitching to make that pocket, make the straps secure onto the bag. We don't want them ripping off. Okay, so let's go to the machine and stitch these on. So these have already been stitched into the edge. The webbing has been stitched onto the fabric already, but we're going to re-stitch on top of this. Let's do both sides. I changed my bobbin size. I had matching bobbin thread in the top and bottom. Just easier to make sure that we don't see any glimpses of a foreign colour coming through onto the black webbing. So just with a edge stitch, let's attach these straps onto our seams of our outside of our duffel tote. As you're going over your intersections, just make sure that the seams haven't closed up. We come into our 1/2 inch chalk mark. Okay, so there's no seams caught up there. Back, forward, and let's come down again. You could do a crosshatch bar tack type thing there. It's up to you. So I'm feeling to make sure that those seams have stayed open. I don't want any bulk. Okay, just checking to make sure my seams are closed. Then let's do the other side. To our seam, just check the seam. To our seam. Come to our 1/2 inch, cross back, and down again. Let's just check our width and our length to make sure that we've got some lining the same size. Just trimming up so as it's the same size as my outside square. You could just lay it on if you wish. I'm just using the grids of my cutting board to do this. So there's my lining. Then we have some pockets. Well, we're going to make some pockets to go inside our lining, and we've got the width of our bag, our tote, and I wanted them to be about a block deep, so they're the same width, and so they're 7 and 7, so we cut about 16 or 17 inches in depth and the 21 inches in width. And so these are going to end up being just some patch pockets, which we're going to sew the bottom seam of them, so we're creating a tube. So long seams together. And we're going to sew across them with 1/2 inch seam on both of those. Okay, so there we are. We've got the seam stitch. Turn it inside out, and then open. Okay, so we press this so as our seams are in the inside. Open up a piece of the lining. And then we're going to lay our pocket over our lining. And we're just checking that. I think I put it about 6 or 7 inches up. We don't want it too far towards the hem of or the bottom seam of the tote. We want it to be so as you can put your hand in and get to it. And I'm just marking 3 equal divisions. One side we've got 3 pockets, and the other side we put 2 pockets. We just did a halfway line rather than sectioning it into thirds, so as we've got end up with 5 pockets you can just slip things into, because it is a duffel tote. It is as an overnight bag, and you can just put a few loose things into those patch pockets. So we're stitching along the bottom of this through all layers. We're going to stitch along the bottom, and then we're going to stitch our divisions. We do that on both sides. Right, let's just line our side of our end sections. Just pin this onto our fabric, and then we're going to be stitching around the outside edge of where we stitched on our piping. The reason we put a flat sashing join in this panel was to give this panel length, because it needs to be a certain length so as we can accommodate sewing our blocks around the outside edge of it. Wanted to make sure every machine brand was able to do this, so that's why we restricted ourselves to this size block. So just sewing in the middle of the seam allowance, and then we'll trim off our edges. Trim back to the raw edge. So we have a pair of ends, they're ready to go. Lay one side of our tote bag towards us, and then we're going to create a zip, the correct length for this bag. So we want to use an open-ended zip, and I'm going to do a couple of cloth stoppers so as the zip doesn't go into the seam, it sits back short to create less bulk because we're using piping. So I'm just going to make a little sleeve for the zip to slip into. But first of all, just for safety, I want to just zigzag those teeth closed at either end of the zip so as there's no way I'm going to lose my runner off the zip while I'm manipulating it and putting it into a bag. I've cut a 3x3 square. I just want to sew a 1/2 inch seam up the edge. Might be slightly less than a 1/2 inch seam. I want to be able to actually have that. This is a 1/2 inch seam, but it's probably a shy 1/2 inch seam. Open that seam up so there's no bulk, of course. Just finger pressing that seam open. Just use your nail. And that seam will stay open. Then we want to slip our zip into position up that tube. So the wrong side of the zip is on the wrong side where the seam is, and the right side of the zip is the flat side of the tube. Push it all the way to the very, very end. Slide the tube of fabric back down so the ends are level, and stitch in the middle. So if it's a 3-inch length of tube, so we want to stitch about 1.5 inches across. I'm just going back and forth. Okay, so we've stitched there. We want to grab the zip at the end and shimmy that tube of fabric back along the zip and cut off a good inch of zip tape. Fold the tube down and then fold the other end of the tube on top of it. So that gives us a nice flat end with no bulk from the zip. On each end of the zip. Okay. And it acts as a stopper at both ends of the zip. But it's nice and thin at the end there, so when it goes into the seam, it's not going to cause us any lumps and bumps. Okay, so we've got our top of our bag towards us, which will be the opening. Let's clip this together and sew about a 3/4 of an inch seam. So 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch seam along that top edge where the zip's going to go. When I say sew a long stitch, because that stitching is going to come out, we just want to actually get this position so as that we can have a seam to put our zip onto. So let's capture the ends with some clips and just make sure they are level. and the zip is wrong side up, and we're going to put some tape across our zip. You can pin it or you can baste it, whatever suits you to put a zip in. I'm just using washi tape. Okay, then to the machine, and we're going to stitch a presser foot in from the seam join. I'm starting at the end that does not have the zip pull, but first of all, let's just capture our ends of our zips within the seam allowance of the seam at the top of the tote. Let's just capture that into place. Get our handles out of the way. I'm rolling the rest of the body of the bag up, and I'm using probably a size 3 stitch, and just using the edge of the presser foot, running along the groove of that top seam, which has been basted together and pressed open. Right, now I can feel that I've got a zip runner there. So let's open some stitches up and pull the puller through so I can see where it is. Break some more stitches, push the zip pull out of the way. Okay, as you can see that I've sewn through the washi tape. Let's go down the other side. There's my zip pull there. It's still captured in that seam. That seam is still closed past the zip pull. Let's put our presser foot against the edge of our seam opening. Sew down to our zip pull, and then lift the foot and pull that up above it so it's out of the way, and complete the rest of our zip. So the zip stitching, the top stitching is final, but the seam that we stitched up to give us an opening or the seams for the zip to sit onto is basting. So we're going to pull those stitches out, so all the way along the seam, because the zip's now attached with its top stitching, in preparation to put our lining on the other side of it. Just be patient. It's going through batting and backing, so the stitches are quite firm, even though they might be long basting stitches. They're still quite firm. Right, so we've taken our stitches out. We're going to add our first piece of lining to one side of our tote. So there's our pockets, you can see, and that wants to be stitched to that side of the zip. So what we're going to do is we're going to just flip the page like you can see I've done there. We're going to clip the ends along the edge of that seam so it's the raw edge of our lining against the raw edge of the zip seam. And I'm just going to use some washi tape and just keep that into place. If you want to pin it, by all means do. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this to the right side and stitch on our original row of stitching again. Some people might want to just stitch the seam to the zip tape. That is fine. But I've stitched on the original row of stitching again. Okay, and I'm going to do the same for the other side. So there's my double pockets, flip it over, attach those at the end, and then stitch them down. So there we have our lining either side of our zip, and it's been stitched into position with our pockets on the inside. Just check to make sure that you don't need to trim your lining in length, because it may be a little bit long if we have because we've set it down from the center of the zip teeth. Just check. It doesn't matter if it's too long. We want to sew our bottom seam of our bag, again with a bigger seam than just your 1/2 inch seam. I use 3/4 inch seam again. Remember, you're going through 2 pieces of straps with the webbing on them, so just take your time. You might want to stitch that seam twice. And do the same with the bottom of the lining. Stitch the seam across the bottom and open it up. If you find that the seam will not stay open on the quilted panels seam, this seam, by all means open it up. You can zigzag it open so as that once the seam's been pressed open, you can go in there and you can actually zigzag the seam so as it will stay open for more extra security. Up to you. Especially if you've got a webbing that is not very heat friendly. And let's turn this through so we have a tube ready for us to add our outside panels onto. First of all, we need to just put seam on seam and attach our lining all the way around the edge of the perimeter of the tote ends. So let's just position these, get our central bottom seam on bottom seam. Our top seam is already caught with the zip. I'm just pinching those together. There we are. So they're clipped around the edges into position. We want to stitch those so as the stitching is on the original row of stitching. Turn the bag inside out, and I've turned it out through the zipper. You don't need to turn it out through the zipper. It's important to make sure that zipper does stay open though while you're attaching your ends, because once the ends are attached to it, you won't be able to get back into it. So what I'm doing is putting my base seam onto my zip seam and then quartering it. So I've got quarters. So I've got my quarters halfway through. You can measure it with a tape measure if you want, which I've just actually put center bottom seam to zip seam and then just quartered that. And I'm just going to mark my quarters on my end panels. Fold that in half again. Mark my quarter and my quarter. Do this for both ends. Then make sure that your pocket is in the right position. Don't put it upside down. And I put the top mark to my zip seam, quarter mark to the side panel, bottom seam to the bottom mark of my side panel, and then the quarter mark to quarter mark of my remaining side panel. And there we have it. So we've got those into position. Now just pin them or quilt clip them so as that all the seams lay flat against each other. Adding the seam in is a bit of a wrestle. It doesn't feel comfortable because you're putting a straight line onto a curve, but it does work. And you might want to just work in sections just to get it right, rather than going all the way around the outside edge. So I start with my panel seam up. So I'm sewing on my panel seam so I can see my curve. And with my zip foot on, I'm going to stitch around my first curve. I usually start with one of the bottom curves. And we're sewing so as our zip foot is right up against our piping. So it's a little bit hard to see here. I need a good light so I can see, but I think that it's just a little bit hard to see. But as you can see, I've got raw edge against raw edge of both the tote bag and the end panel. Now I'm doing my first quarter, and I'm just going to turn it through and have a look to see how that is. Now you can see that my piping is a bit loose, you can see that stitching, but what I'm going to do is that once I've actually done around the whole outside edge, I'm going to re-stitch that seam again, pushing it even tighter against the zip foot, because it will be in position, and you can push it even tighter against it for the second row of stitching around the outside edge, and you will find that when you turn it through, that piping's nice and tight and into position. Difference between using a domestic machine and a commercial machine. See, now that's into position. You can't see the stitching on the piping. Let's take your time and put both ends of the tote bag on. I'm just turning this through to show you before I do my final section. That's what this looks like. So it's got piping in it. So you can see that it is quite... It fits well. There's no gathering on either side. It fits quite well. There's our pocket. And the piping cord acts a little bit like a spine because it allows it to sit up by itself. Do the other end. Well, I've cut some bias cut binding. I'm just folding my edge in because we're just going to bind this final seam. So we've folded the binding in half. I've turned that edge in about a good 1/4 of an inch, and it's double. And we're just going to lay edge on edge, and with the foot we're going to stitch into the middle of this seam. It doesn't have to be up against the piping, we just want it to be in the middle. We want to finish this raw edge. Some of you, if you've got an overlocker, you could just overlock this finish, or you could just zigzag the layers together, whatever suits you. I have already gone around the outside of this seam with my zigzag to keep those edges and seams together. It just makes it easier to do the binding if they are zigzagged together to start with. Oops, I'm a bit short. Add on a piece. Go around the outside edge. When we come to our intersection, just cross it over by about an inch or so. Trim off, and then with a wide zigzag, just fold over and zigzag that remaining folded edge. Doesn't have to be a straight stitch. Having the bias binding means that going around the curves are much, much easier. If you cut it just across selvage of your fabric, you'll find that it's a little bit hard to go around the curved corners with binding. Right, there we have it. You'll have some straggling threads, just trim those off. So there we have our inside of our tote. Let's pull it through the opening. Push all the seams out. You might want to give it a little bit of a press. Great way of using the scraps. Hope you enjoyed that.
You should now be looking at your beautiful, completed, scrappy duffel tote bag. Good luck with your entries to the Sew Along competition. We can't wait to see everyone's finished project. I bet they all look amazing. Well, that's all from us. Happy sewing!